Okay, I forgot to bring the recorder to church tonight, so I'm just going to go back over Psalm 140 by myself, looking at the notes and looking at the scripture. So, sorry. Again, we're in Psalm 140. This is a psalm titled To the Chief Musician, a psalm of David. That's the inscription of the psalm, which, as a reminder, is part of the scripture. It's not something that has been added on later on. It's actually part of the psalm itself. We have it up above like it's a title, but actually it's the inscription and part of the scripture. So that is the start of it there. The theme is similar to many of David's other psalms in which he cried out to God in a time of trouble. The trouble seems to be a slanderer against him, perhaps when he was a fugitive escaping from Saul's court. And we'll find out later on. I think that might not be the case based on some of David's requests later on. But again, it's to the chief musician. And Charles Spurgeon remarked, the writer wished this experimental hymn to be under the care of the chief master of song, that it might neither be left unsung nor chanted in a slovenly manner. So take that for what you will from Charles Spurgeon. Now, the first three verses are praying for deliverance. And it is, deliver me, O Lord, from evil men. Preserve me from violent men, who plan evil things in their heart, and stir up wars continually. They make their tongues sharp as serpents, and under their lips is the venom of asps. And then Selah. So, deliver me, O Lord, from evil men. Many times in David's life he suffered under the presence and pressure of evil and violent men. This desperate song comes from such a time and shows its urgency by having no prelude of praise or contemplation. David went straight to the plea. He got right down to business. And the persecuted man turns to God in prayer. He could not do no wiser thing. Who can meet the evil man and defeat him, save Jehovah himself, whose infinite goodness is more than a match for all the evil in the universe? Again, that's from Spurgeon. And I mentioned that some translations have from the evil man and preserve me from violent man, or maybe from violent men. But the idea, I guess, is that the plural might be there to indicate like the extreme violence and the extreme evil that is characteristic of this man, and not multiple men, but one man in particular who has such evil that they had to use a plural to kind of emphasize how much evil and how much violent. And there are those who put this as a psalm, and it's probably accurate, that this psalm can also be seen as a prophetic psalm looking at the remnant, the faithful remnant in the tribulation period, and the evil man in that case, and his evil men. But the evil man would be, of course, the Antichrist. And there is that aspect of this psalm that it would be one that was written and prophetically will be sang by those the faithful remnant in the end times, in the tribulation period. And our first two questions, the first one, they're fill-in-the-blank questions. The psalm pleads, deliver me, O Lord, from evil men. And then number two, David asks God to preserve him from violent men. And these violent men who plan evil things in their hearts. Those evil men were known by the evil things in their heart. Their evil actions were not accidents disconnected from their true nature, as shown in that they were always ready for conflict and war. So they had evil things in their heart. And it is an awful thing to have such a heart disease as this. When the imagination gloats over doing harm to others, it is a sure sign that the entire nature is far gone in wickedness. And of course we know Jesus said, out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. And so these lies and slander that these evil men or this evil man does. It's coming up out of the evil intent of the heart and evil content of the heart. It says they continually get together for war. John Trapp noted that the Hebrew is they gather wars as serpents gather poison to vomit out at others. And question 3 was, the evil men plan evil things in their heart. And they sharpen their tongues like a serpent. And they sharpen their tongues like a serpent. The desire for war and evil things is often expressed in sharp and poisonous words. David felt both the sting and poison of such men and their words. And someone had made a comment about the fact that we can see in this the like a serpent of Eden, where the lies and stuff that basically the devil was slandering God, calling him a liar, but doing it in such a way that made Adam and Eve feel like it's like something they desired, something they wanted. And possibly in the same way here, maybe it's drawing a connection to the fact that these people are lying about David and slandering him in a way to get people who otherwise wouldn't go against him to go against him and to be his enemy. And Paul quoted Psalm 143 and Romans 3:13 as part of his description of man's deep sinfulness. And look real quick at Romans 3:13, and actually a little bit before that even. It starts out with, in verse 9 of Romans 3:9, what then? Are the Jews any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greek, are under sin. As it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. All have turned aside, together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. And then here's verse 13. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood, and their paths are ruin and misery. The way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. And we discussed a little bit about the no fear of God before their eyes. Basically, they don't believe that God is going to intercede. They don't believe that God is going to punish the wicked. They think they're getting away with it. They mistake God's patience and his long-sufferingness to mean that he is either uninterested or unable to make things right. But they should know that God is just giving them a chance to turn around, a chance to repent, a chance to come back to him. God doesn't just zap us with lightning as soon as we sin. He gives us opportunities to come to him, and he sends warnings, and of course we have the Bible, and we have all of these ways that God has reached out and tried to let us know about his plan of salvation, and he gives us time. It's not just eternal time. At some point then the time is up, and that could be either when he comes back, or it could be whenever you die. Whatever state you're in at that point, either when you die or when Jesus comes back, is the state you will be in for eternity. If that's separated from God, if you've not repented from your wicked ways and turned to him for forgiveness, then you're stuck there. And then, so that's number 4 in our questions, is the tongues of the wicked are sharpened like a serpent. Then we have the word Selah, and the word indicates some sort of a pause, either a musical expression or for careful thought and meditation, or both. I always heard growing up that Selah meant like pause and think about that, and that always seems to apply to where we see that in the Psalms here. And it's 3 times in this psalm, and here it indicates that the deep sinfulness of man is worthy of our careful consideration. Again, pause, think about that. Think about what was just said about the evil men or evil man, the violent man, the evil things in their hearts, stirring up wars, their tongues sharp as serpents, under their lips is the venom of asps, all of that. Pause and think about that. And Derek Kittner said, what emerges clearly from this passage is that evil can arise not from any pressure of circumstances, but from a love of violence, cruelty, and intrigue for their own sake. Which is true. It's not always some outside thing. It's like Jesus said, it's what's inside that causes us to sin, causes us to do evil, and that is the case here. They're planning evil in their hearts, and that is what they are, evil men. So let's look on now to the next 2 verses, verses 4 and 5, praying for preservation. David writes, guard me, O Lord, from the hands of the wicked. Preserve me from violent men who have planned to trip up my feet. The arrogant have hidden a trap for me, and with cords they have spread a net. Beside the way they have set snares for me. And again, Selah. And in the first portion of the psalm, David acknowledged the presence of the wicked and violent men or man. With this such a realistic view that he then requested God to preserve him from said violent men or man. Thus David was hunted as a rebel. Christ was crucified as a blasphemer, and the primitive Christians were tortured as guilty of incest and murder, said Horn. And Van Jimmeren here says, the wicked may arrogantly desire, plan, and execute, but the master of the universe cannot tolerate anarchy for long. To this end, the plea charges into an imprecatory prayer. We'll see in the little bit from now, actually. But question 5 is, the psalmist prays, keep me, O Lord, from the hands of the wicked. Keep me, O Lord, from the hands of the wicked, in Psalm 140, verse 4. Now the proud have hidden a snare for me. They hope to make David trip over a series of hidden snares, cords, nets, traps, many of which were expressed in their poisonous words from verse 3. David was not blind to the traps, but he had hope in God's help. And one of the things the guy I listen to always does at the end of his review or commentaries on the Psalms that he does is how they point to Jesus. I don't think in this one, this was one of the things that he mentioned that points to Jesus, although he said there was, you could take time and find, many, many, many things in all scriptures that point to Jesus. But one here, I think, it reminded me of how the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herodians, like all these other people, scribes and all this, lawyers, tried to set traps for Jesus and trying to get him either to say something that would get him in Dutch with the people or get him in trouble with the Romans. So, for example, the question about, is it right to pay taxes? And they hope that Jesus, if he said that it's not right to pay taxes, which would make the people happy because they don't like paying taxes any more than we do, then that would make the Romans upset, and they could go to the Romans and say, oh, he's saying people shouldn't pay taxes. But if Jesus says, yeah, you got to pay taxes, then that would make the people upset, and maybe they would no longer consider Jesus to be a prophet or more, as he is much more than a prophet. They would not see Jesus as someone to look to. But of course, Jesus always managed to not only take whatever their question was and turn it back and make a point. Like with that, he said, show me a coin, and it's like, whose image is on there? And it's Caesar. It's like, well, then render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. But Jesus always was able to not only like diffuse the questions they were asking and answer them in a way that was, always good, because that's what Jesus did, but also, like, try to use that, I think, as a learning opportunity, as a way to teach and actually even reach these people. When the Sadducees came with their kind of goofy scenario of a man with 7 brothers or 6 brothers, I'm not sure. It was 7 men altogether, or if it was a man plus 7 brothers. But the man was married to a wife. He died without having kids. So, as the law stated, that one of his brothers needed to marry that woman and have a kid that would be counted as the original husband's kid. And so it went through, and each brother in turn married and then died before having a kid for the original brother with that lady. And then they said, okay, well, in the resurrection, then whose husband is she? Because she married all of them, all 7 of them, let's say. And Jesus was able to, basically get to the heart of the matter, the fact that they didn't believe what the Bible had said about the resurrection, about how that God was the God of the living, not the dead. And, Jesus always managed to take the traps that they had tried to lay for him and tried to get him in, and he managed to turn that around for the good of everybody, really, something to learn, and that God was able to use. And if it didn't reach them, then in the scriptures it's reached, everybody down through the ages. Now, in this, Spurgeon had said, if a godly man can be cajoled or bribed or cowed or made angry, the wicked will make the attempt. Ready are they to twist his words, misread his intentions, and misdirect his efforts, ready to fawn and lie and make themselves mean in the last degree, so that they may accomplish their abominable purpose. And again, you can look at how the Pharisees did. They would come and act like they really were interested in what Jesus said. With the idea with the taxes, I think they even came and said, we know you don't, pay any mind to what people say. You just care about what God says. They were honoring with words, but their hearts were far away, as the scriptures say. And number 6 in our questions is, the proud have hidden a snare for the psalmist in Psalm 145, or 140, verse 5. The proud have hidden a snare for the psalmist. And then it's end, of course, also with Selah. When David considered the danger coming from those who opposed him, it prompted a thoughtful pause. Pause. Think about that. Think about what these people are trying. They're planning to trip him up, hidden traps, spread as a net, set snares, and all this stuff. Think about all that. Then we move on to verses 6 through 8, which is seeking God's help and praying to the God of strength and salvation. David wrote, I said to the Lord, you are my God. Give ear to the voice of my pleas for mercy, O Lord. O Lord, my God, the strength of my salvation, you have covered my head in the day of battle. Grant not, O Lord, the desires of the wicked. Do not further their evil plot, or they will be exalted. Selah. Again, pause, think about that. And it says, you are my God. David would worship no other God. His allegiance was to Yahweh alone. The devotion gave him confidence that God would hear the voice of his supplications. God doesn't just hear the words of the cry, but the voice of the cry. It is distinctive and meaningful to him. Again from Spurgeon, thou art my God. In opposition to the gods of the heathen, they may worship Baal and Asherah, but thou art my God. I count other gods to be idols, the works of men's hands, and I despise them. So, question 7 we had, David declares, I said to the Lord, you are my God. That was in Psalm 140, verse 6. And, O God, the Lord of my strength, O God, the Lord, the strength of my salvation. David cries out to Yahweh, which is God, his master, which is Lord, Adonai. And I mentioned that they use basically all 3 different terms there, the covenant name for God, as well as I guess God in all caps like that is referring to same as capital Lord, meaning Yahweh, the covenant name of God, and as well as Adonai, translated Lord, to mean master, recognizing God as the Lord of his life and no other God. The true God could actually help David, being the strength of his salvation. To himself and to all others, his escape had been marvelous. How could it be accounted for, except that an unseen shield had been around him, covering his head in the day of battle, said F.B. Meyer. And the question 8 was, the psalmist calls God the strength of his salvation. Psalm 140, verse 7. God calls the psalmist the strength of his salvation. And again, to F.B. Meyer's quote about his escapes being marvelous, you think about, I mentioned this in a study, that Saul, different times, tried to impale David with his spear, and Saul wasn't a slacker with a spear. That was like kind of his weapon. And so the fact that David did not get killed by Saul or grievously injured by Saul in any of those situations was certainly a testament to the fact that God was looking out for him. God was preventing Saul from killing David or injuring David in those times, because he had, plans for David, and he was protecting him. He was, as it says, you have covered my head in the day of battle. And David knew many literal battles. He also lived through many battles with lying and slanderous men. David testified that God had been his protection, his shield, his armor in those battles. And according to Meyer, cited in Spurgeon, day of battle is better translated day of armor, but I also heard that would actually be more literally translated. What was translated day of battle is day of weapons, like the days when weapons are drawn, the days of battle, the days of war. And again, Spurgeon here says that it's to say God had been David's armor bearer. The Lord had borne a shield before him, instead of the harness in which warriors put their confidence. God had covered David with a coat of mail, which is of course armor, through which no sword of the enemy could possibly cut its way. Again, so says Charles Spurgeon. Do not grant, O Lord, the desires of the wicked. In recognizing the supremacy of Yahweh, David realized that if God were to help the wicked, then they would be exalted. He prayed for God to work for his people and against the desire of the wicked. Because the desire of the wicked, of course, is against God's people and against God. So question 9 was, David prays that God not grant the desires of the wicked. Psalm 140, verse 8. David prays that God not grant the desires of the wicked. And then again, Selah, we see here for the final time in this particular psalm. When David considered the need for the wicked to be stopped in their evil plotting, it again prompted a thoughtful pause, a moment of contemplation about what was being asked and maybe the stakes that are at play there. That if they're not stopped, then they will be exalted. And we kind of see that played out in when the wicked get away with what they do and they don't get punished, then it makes people, wonder. It's like, well, how come, what's so wrong about what they're doing if they are prospering? And of course, that's a very limited, like this life only view of what's going on. We know that there is a judgment to come, and that if you don't get right with God, you don't accept Jesus as your Savior and Lord, then the momentary success you've had in this life will, it's literally a drop in the bucket, a nothing compared to the eternity you'll spend separated from God. So, while it might seem like the wicked are prospering, we know that in the end God makes all things right and sets all things right. And we'll see a little bit more of that here. In the next verses 9 through 11, David's prayer regarding the wicked, which is an imprecatory prayer, as it requests a kind of punishment for the wicked. But we'll see it's a special kind, I think, maybe of punishment. And based on this, it makes me question whether or not this was written as a way talking about Saul, because David always we always respected the fact that Saul was God's anointed, and he didn't take advantage of opportunities that he had to try to injure Saul, to try to, kill the man who was trying to kill him, and multiple times tried to kill him and killed other people trying to get to David. David didn't take those opportunities because he said, far be it from me to lift my hand to the Lord's anointed. That's how David saw Saul, a little tough to say. That's how he saw Saul, King Saul, the entire time. Even though David had been anointed to be king, he was waiting on God's timetable to make that happen. He never was in open rebellion, or even closeted rebellion, whatever you'd call that, hidden rebellion. He was never plotting against Saul the way Saul thought. He was just trying to serve. David was trying to serve God and serve Israel and serve Saul. But Saul's jealousy blinded him to that, and his ambition for his sons to follow him as king, for Jonathan to be king after him, blinded him to that. And all he saw was just what was typical in the world, and that is, if you're the king, that means that your son becomes king, and his son becomes king. And we know that became the case with David, because David was a man after God's heart, and David did what was right. But Saul kind of forgot the fact that he was, picked up out of nothing to become king. And so just that itself is like the honor, and he should have been faithful to God, and then maybe something would have been different. But he wasn't. He went with the people, and when they wanted to do something, he went with that. Didn't devote to destruction all I think it was the Amaleks, or the Amalekites, I guess would be the way to say it. And instead, he let the people keep choice parts and spared the king and all that sort of stuff. And because of that and other stuff, that he got the kingdom ripped away from him. And instead of just repenting and saying, well, maybe I don't have a dynasty, but I'm going to be the best king that I can be this entire time, instead, he chose to spend so much of his time and effort, chasing after David, trying to kill David, being obsessed with finding David, because he knew David was going to be the one to be the king in his stead. And, it's a thing to ponder, what would have happened to Saul's kingdom, or his rule, if he had turned back to God, if he had turned back and asked for forgiveness and followed God from then on out. What would his end have been like? What would the kingdom, what shape would it have been in? You take away David and his faithful warriors from your army because you're trying to kill David and them. You kind of leave yourself open to problems. And that's all, neither here nor there. Bit of a rabbit trail. But anyhow, this is why I don't think this is how David would pray to God about Saul. I think he would pray that Saul would, realize what he was doing and come to his senses. And I think he certainly loved Jonathan. I think he also loved Saul, just because he was God's anointed. He was the king, and David was faithful that way. So let's see what it says here in Psalm 140, verses 9 through 11. It says, "As for the head of those who surround me, let the mischief of their lips overwhelm them. Let burning coals fall upon them. Let them be cast into fire, into miry pits, no more to rise. Let not the slanderer be established in the land. Let evil hunt down the violent man speedily." Now again, we don't know the exact occasion in David's life for this prayer. So we don't know who is meant by the head, as for the head of those who surround me. And again, the commentator here thinks it could have been Saul. Said it could have been Doeg, that's how you pronounce his name, Doeg, maybe, who was an evil, violent man, and we know he was kind of a, saw an opportunity, killed a bunch of priests to become higher up in Saul's estimation, and it was a horrible situation there. And it's funny because the commentator here, he says, if this prayer was about Saul, it's another example of how David would not violently strike against Saul even when he had the opportunity. Two different times, 1 Samuel 24, 1-7, and 1 Samuel 26, 7-11. David would not touch Saul for all his faults and sins. Saul was God's anointed king. When David was attacked by Saul, he would pour out his heart in prayer to the Lord, trusting Saul's punishment to God in heaven rather than taking it in his own hands. I guess I have to look back and see times when it was actually, verifiable, talking about Saul, and if David was asking for this type of retribution upon Saul from God. I don't know. It says, let the evil of their lips cover them. David prayed for simple justice in regard to his enemies. He prayed they would be covered with the same evil they had spoken against others. Now, under the new covenant, we are not told to return evil for evil, but we sympathize with David's cry for justice. And again, I think that regardless of who it's about, even if it was about Saul, the thing is, David isn't returning evil for evil. He's not striking out against them. He is asking that God would met out the justice. And God's justice is always perfect. It's always just. It's truly justice. It's not burdened or prejudiced by men's failings and limited knowledge and whatever goes into our discrepancies on things, that we can't come to anything really with a completely clean slate. And even if we could, we don't come to it still with all of God's knowledge. So leaving the justice and the punishment, if there is any, over to God is to, like, the best thing possible. That's what you should do. It's what David is doing here, and it's what we always should do, is leave everything to God. And, if hopefully the person can be turned from their wicked ways and, be brought into the fold, then that is great. If not, then, we let God deal with the consequences of the person refusing his invitation. But it says, Horn here says, their lips which uttered mischief against others shall be the means of covering themselves with confusion. When out of their own mouths they shall be judged. Those tongues which have contributed to set the world on fire shall be tormented with the hot burning coals of eternal vengeance. And it said also that let burning coals fall upon them. David prayed that the same fire the wicked men poured on others would be poured on them. He prayed that this would destroy the wicked and that they would be hunted by evil until they were overthrown. Again, Kittner points out, the burning coals and pits are probably metaphorical, the former for the searing words which they loved to use, the latter for the traps and pitfalls they had made for others. And at first when I read that, it was like, well, obviously it's metaphorical, but that's why you got to read the whole quote before you comment on it, I suppose, because it makes a lot of sense that he's basically looking back at the first couple of parts there, the first 3 verses about their evil plans and their tongues and what they're saying, and then the 4 and 5 about how that they have, planned to trip up David. They've hidden traps for him, spread snares and that, and so it makes a lot of sense that these burning coals represent the things they've said being fallen on them again. In fact, they fall into deep pits, miry pits, is showing the way that they set traps, that they would also fall into those traps. And Spurgeon, however, thinks the psalmist doubtlessly had before his mind's eye the picture of Sodom, where burning coals fell on the guilty cities, and where men stumbled into the fire, and when they tried to escape, fell into the deep slime pits and perished. And then the next part here, let evil hunt the violent man. These evil men hunted David. We saw in verses 4 through 6. David prayed that the same would be returned to them, that the hunters would be hunted by their very evil. And evil speakers and false accusers shall gain no lasting establishment, but punishment shall hunt sin through all its doubles and seize it at last as its legal prey, said Horn. And then we see in the last two verses, 12 and 13, confidence in God's victory. David wrote, I know that the Lord will maintain the cause of the afflicted and will execute justice for the needy. Surely the righteous shall give thanks to your name. The upright shall dwell in your presence. And as we mentioned in class, we often see in David's Psalms, or in the Psalms in general maybe even, that there's a problem, David comes to God with it, and then before it's over, he is praising God for taking care of the problem. Even if the problem hasn't been taken care of already, he knows that God has heard his problem, he's heard his pleas, and he is going to act on them in keeping with God's nature. And that is a good thing, because God's goodness, his holiness, his mercy, his love, his steadfast love that endures forever, we know that that will mean that God will react in a way, again, keeping with his character. And so David can be confident in saying that the Lord will maintain the cause of the afflicted and justice for the poor. People that would seem like that they have no advocate, nobody pleading their case, they're poor and afflicted. It may seem like they have nothing, but they have God, and God sees, and God knows, and God will intercede and act. And so, Horn again says that the unjust and oppressive men shall, in the end, suffer proportionally. We are assured from this consideration, namely, that the Almighty is the patron of the injured and oppressed. So we can have faith and confidence that God sees and God knows and God will act. And Spurgeon said, many talk as if the poor had no rights worth noticing, but they will sooner or later find out their mistake when the judge of all the earth begins to plead with them. And that kind of goes again back to that verse in Romans saying about they have no fear of God, essentially. Those that trying to that are causing the affliction and doing injustice to the poor will find out that they have reason to fear God because he's a just God and he doesn't let that kind of stuff slide. He's gonna make that right. And I think Adam Clark maybe is the guy quoted here. It says, every person who is persecuted for righteousness' sake has God for his peculiar help and refuge, and the persecutor has the same God as his especial enemy. And so, question 10 is the psalmist is confident that the Lord will maintain the cause of the afflicted. Psalm 140, verse 12. The psalmist is confident that the Lord will maintain the cause of the afflicted. Then it continues, surely the righteous shall give thanks to your name. This psalm ends on a note of confidence. Though assaulted by the wicked, David has put his trust in the Lord and gave all his desire of retribution unto him. David believed that in the end the righteous would be thankful and the upright would dwell in your presence, the best reward of all. Van Jimmeren says, at the time of the intervention and vindication, the righteous will alter their prayers for deliverance into songs of triumph. And Derek Kittner says, the last line is wholly positive. His heart is free to find its true home. And his last words made the climax to which the whole of Scripture moves. His servants shall serve him, and they shall see his face. Revelation 22:3, part F, I guess, of that. And G. Campbell Morgan noted that Psalm 140 begins in great trouble and sorrow, but ends in praise and triumph. If sorrow is a certainty, so also is the action of Jehovah. Sorrow and darkness come to all men, but only those who know God and are sure of Him make suffering and the night occasions of triumphant psalmody, which I guess is making psalms, singing hymns, much like Paul, I think, and Silas when they were locked up, singing hymns in the prison. And again, it's only through the knowing of God, being sure of Him and His mercy and His steadfast love and His grace that He gives us, that lets you to rejoice in the times of adversity and know that even if things currently aren't what you wish them to be, that God sees, God knows, and He will maintain the cause of the afflicted and justice for the poor. So that is Psalm 140, Psalm of David. And next week we will look at Psalm 141. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it.